You've entered a world you cannot control, Baba Uche replied. And the deeper you go, the more the darkness will consume you. Before Jide could respond, Baba Uche turned and left as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving Jide standing in the middle of his opulent office, feeling an unsettling weight settle on his shoulders. Jide's power had always come from his ability to manipulate and control those around him. But now, as whispers of his dark practices spread further, he began to realize that his control was slipping. The foundation of his empire, built on fear, manipulation, and lies, was beginning to crack. Alumide, once one of his closest allies, had become a problem. Jide could see it in his eyes. Alumide had been growing suspicious for months. And now, he was openly questioning Jide's methods. If Alumide turned against him, others would follow. And that would mean the end of everything Jide had worked for. It started one Sunday afternoon when Alumide came to Jide's office, his expression tense and filled with distrust. I've heard the rumors, Jide, Alumide said, his voice low and controlled. People are beginning to question the legitimacy of the church. There are even talks of exposing your methods to the public. Jide's heart skipped a beat. His once loyal confidant was now an enemy. But Jide couldn't show weakness. He had to maintain control. You're just hearing gossip, Jide said, forcing a smile. There will always be those who doubt. But I have the truth on my side. People need to believe. Alumide shook his head. It's more than that, Jide. I've seen what you've done. You've used people, manipulated their fears, and now you're playing with forces that no one should mess with. Jide felt his temper flare, but he quickly masked it. You don't understand, Alumide. I've built this. Everything I've done is for a purpose. You of all people should know that power requires sacrifice. Alumide stepped closer, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. I don't care about your sacrifices anymore. You've gone too far. People are starting to see you for who you really are. You're not a prophet, you're a fraud. In a swift motion, Jide grabbed Alumide by the collar and slammed him against the wall. His eyes blazed with fury. You're no longer welcome here, he hissed. You've made your choice. Alumide struggled but then, surprisingly, backed down. I'm leaving, Jide. But mark my words, you won't be able to control this forever. The door slammed shut behind Alumide, and Jide stood frozen for a moment, his pulse racing. He had just lost one of his most loyal allies, but he knew he couldn't show weakness. People like Alumide were replaceable. But as the night fell, Jide couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of his control. Weeks passed, and the tension in Jide's church grew palpable. He could no longer rely on his usual methods of manipulation. People were starting to ask questions, to demand answers. Some of his top tithers had become more reluctant, their contributions dropping. The wealth and influence he had worked so hard for were beginning to slip through his fingers. It was then that Jide received a mysterious invitation. The letter was written in bold, elegant handwriting, and the seal on the envelope bore no mark of any known organization or individual. The letter simply read, "You've awakened forces you cannot control. Come to the old temple at midnight. The answers you seek are waiting." Jide was curious, yet hesitant. He knew that there were things beyond his understanding, things that even Baba Uche had hinted at. But Jide's desire for power was insatiable. He knew this might be the key to securing everything once and for all. At midnight, he arrived at the abandoned temple on the outskirts of Lagos. The air was thick with mist, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows on the crumbling walls. Inside the temple, the air was heavy with the scent of incense and the taste of something ancient, something that sent a shiver down Jide's spine. There, in the center of the temple, stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its face hidden. "Welcome, Jide," the figure said, its voice deep and chilling. "You've come seeking more power. But remember, power always demands a price." Jide stepped forward, his heart pounding with anticipation. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing a man with eyes as black as night. I am a servant of the ancient forces that rule over this world, the man said. You have taken the first step into a world of darkness. But it is not enough to simply desire power. You must embrace it. Jide felt his blood run cold, but his ambition burned hotter than ever. Tell me what I need to do, he said, his voice low and desperate. The figure smiled, a sinister grin that chilled Jide to his core. You must offer what you cherish most. Your soul is already stained, but to truly gain the power you seek, you must make a sacrifice. Your influence will spread like wildfire. But so will your enemies. Choose wisely. Jide's mind raced. What was he willing to give? His wealth? His status? Or was there something deeper at play? Name your price, Jide said, his voice trembling but resolute. I will pay whatever it takes. The figure's grin widened. We shall see, he said. The game has only just begun. Jide could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. As the figure's cryptic words echoed in his mind, his ambition burned brighter than ever. What could he possibly offer to ensure his rise to the top, to secure power that no one could challenge? The question hung in the air like a noxious cloud, thick with uncertainty. The cloaked figure stepped closer. His eyes dark and fathomless. You seek immortality, don't you? You wish to never fall, to stand above all men, even the gods themselves. Jide swallowed hard, his throat dry. Yes, he replied, his voice trembling slightly, but his resolve clear. I want to be untouchable. I want power that lasts beyond death itself. I want to rule this world, and the next. The figure nodded, his grin widening ever so slightly. Then you must give what is most precious to you. There are those who have sought immortality before you, Jide, and they've paid the price, sometimes with their own flesh, sometimes with the lives of those they love. But the price you must pay is different. Jide's heart raced. What do you want? He demanded, barely able to contain the tremor in his voice. You've already sacrificed blood. You've taken lives. But now, you must sacrifice something intangible, something that defines who you are. Your humanity. Your very soul. The words sent a chill through Jide's body. Was he ready to lose himself completely? He had already sold his conscience and moral compass long ago, but could he truly sever all connection to his own humanity? The figure, sensing Jide's hesitation, spoke again, his tone smooth but commanding. Don't mistake this for a simple offering. This is the final step in your ascent. Once you embrace this, there will be no turning back. You will gain what you desire. But you will also lose what remains of your former self. Jide's mind was a storm of thoughts. He thought about all he had worked for, the wealth, the influence, the control over his followers. He thought about how he could dominate, crush anyone who stood in his way. But the cost? The price? Could he truly give up what little remained of his soul? You want power, the figure continued, his voice a low, hypnotic hum. You must offer the one thing that binds you to this mortal coil, your conscience. When you do, you will no longer be Jide the man, you will be Jide the force. A being beyond human. No man, no god will dare stand against you. Jide closed his eyes for a moment. Picturing the life he had built, the kingdom of lies, manipulation, and fear. It all seemed worth it. He wanted to be the ruler of it all. And so, with a trembling breath, he made his decision. I accept, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure smiled, a smile that was far too wide for a human face. Good. Then prepare yourself, Jide, for you will be reborn. The ritual begins now. With that, the cloaked figure raised his hands, and the air around him seemed to shift. The candles flickered violently, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A strange, oppressive energy filled the temple, suffocating Jide as the figure began to chant in a language that Jide couldn't understand. But which resonated deep within his bones. The world around him began to blur, the edges of reality twisting and warping. Jide could feel his very being pulled apart. Pain tore through him like nothing he had ever known, but it wasn't physical pain. It was the sensation of his soul being ripped away, piece by piece. His thoughts became disjointed, and the flickering light seemed to dance in his eyes, blurring the lines between life and death. For what felt like an eternity, Jide was lost in the darkness. His entire existence was reduced to a singular thought: power. Power was all that mattered now. It consumed him, filled the empty void that was once his soul. And in the center of that darkness, he could hear the figure's voice once more. "You are free now, Jide," the figure said, his voice no longer a mere whisper, but a booming, omnipotent presence. "You are more than human now. You are a god among men." When Jide opened his eyes again, the world around him had changed. The dimly lit temple was still there, but it felt smaller. His body felt different, as though he was no longer bound by the limitations of mere flesh. There was a strange new power coursing through him, raw, untapped energy that pulsed in his veins like electricity. The figure, no longer cloaked, stood before him, revealing a face that was both ancient and ageless. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "You are now the master of your own destiny," the figure intoned, his voice echoing in Jide's mind. "With this power, you can reshape the world. You will be the one who decides who rises and who falls." Jide stood there, feeling the power surge through him, but he wasn't satisfied yet. He was no longer human, no longer bound by any earthly rules. He could feel the weight of the dark energy around him, and in that moment, he knew that he could achieve anything, anything at all. But the thought of those who had wronged him, those who had doubted him, sparked a fury in him. He would destroy them all. He would make sure they suffered for every moment of doubt, for every whispered betrayal. The world would know his name, and they would tremble at the sound of it. He turned and began to walk out of the temple, his mind racing with plans. His church, his empire, it was no longer enough. He needed more. He needed to make them all bow before him. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Jide's influence began to spread like wildfire, even faster than before. It was as though the very air around him obeyed his will. Politicians, business moguls, and celebrities all flocked to his church, eager to be in his favor. But Jide no longer needed their money or their adoration. He needed something more: complete control. He knew that the people who had been most loyal to him in the past, those who had followed him from the beginning, were now his greatest threat. They had started to question him. Alyamide, his once trusted ally, had begun speaking out. There were murmurs in the church about the unnatural changes in Jide's sermons, about his increasing demands for money and control. His methods had gone too far, and now, people were beginning to resist. But Jide had no intention of letting them betray him. He knew where Alyamide lived. He knew what weaknesses his enemies had. And as he sat in his office one evening, overlooking the city, a dark plan began to form in his mind. Alyamide would be the first to pay. He arranged for his most loyal followers to go to Alyamide's house, where he was to be confronted. Jide had already planted enough doubt in the minds of Alyamide's closest friends. When they came to his house, Alyamide would be trapped. It was late at night when Alyamide's front door was shattered by a group of men dressed in dark robes. Alyamide had barely enough time to react before they were on him, pulling him from his bed. His wife screamed as they bound Alyamide and dragged him through the house, ignoring her desperate pleas. Jide arrived shortly after, his face a mask of calm, but inside, his heart raced with anticipation. Alyamide had been a threat, but now, he was nothing more than an example. "You thought you could turn against me, Alyamide?" Jide said coldly, standing over his former friend as he lay on the ground, struggling against his restraints. "You thought you could expose me. But you were just another pawn in my game." Alyamide looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You're a monster, Jide. You've lost everything that made you human." Jide knelt down, his hand brushing Alyamide's cheek as he smiled. "I've gained everything that matters. And now, you'll pay the price." With a wave of his hand, the men who had come with him stepped forward, and within seconds, Alyamide's body was gone, his life extinguished as Jide watched from above, his heart pounding with triumph, with Olumite's death. Jide's grip on his church became ironclad. No one dared to question him anymore. Those who once whispered behind his back now groveled at his feet. The wealth and power continued to flood in. His influence stretched beyond his church and into the very fabric of society itself, but with every victory came a new set of enemies. As Jide's empire grew, so did the opposition. There were whispers of people trying to expose him, of rival ministers who began to challenge his teachings, of former allies who had begun to see him for what he truly was. Jide, however, was ready. He had learned from the past, and he was no longer bound by the rules of this world. He would crush anyone who dared oppose him. His power was absolute, but deep inside, there was a small, nagging voice, a whisper that reminded him that no matter how high he rose, no matter how much power he amassed, there would always be someone stronger. And that, perhaps, was the greatest price of all. Jide sat alone in his grand office, staring out over the city as it sparkled beneath the setting sun. The church was thriving, the money flowing, and his influence had reached new heights. Yet, the feeling of satisfaction that he had once imagined would accompany his victory remained absent. The power he had craved, the empire he had built, now felt hollow, like a mansion without a soul. Despite the outward success, Jide could feel the darkness closing in on him. The rituals, the sacrifices, the manipulation, all of it had brought him to the top. But it had also stripped him of something essential. His conscience, long discarded, now felt like an empty void. It wasn't just a metaphorical hole, it was a deep, gnawing emptiness that gnawed at the core of his being. Every victory, every scheme, every deception added to it, but never filled it. Jide was no longer sure of what he was anymore. He had cast aside his humanity, sacrificed his soul for a throne of wealth and power, but now that he sat upon it, he felt more like a puppet than a king. The weight of it all was beginning to suffocate him. He had everything, yet he felt like he was losing everything. Jide's unease deepened as strange occurrences began to plague him. At night, he would hear whispers in the darkness, voices calling his name, speaking in languages he didn't understand. Shadows would move in the corners of his vision, and his reflection in the mirror seemed to twist, as if it didn't belong to him anymore. The people who had once worshipped him, now like moths to a flame, began to fade away. More and more members started to leave, quietly retreating from the church. Some would give excuses about needing to focus on their personal lives, but Jide knew the truth. They could feel the corruption. They could sense the darkness in him. His once unwavering control over them was beginning to slip. It was the beginning of the end. Those who had stayed in his service were no longer his loyal followers, they were just followers of power. They, too, were getting nervous. They knew Jide's rise had been too quick, too unnatural. They could feel the toll the dark forces were taking on him, but Jide, blinded by his own pride, refused to see it. He had sold his soul for this life, he would not let it crumble now. One evening, as Jide paced back and forth in his office, a familiar figure appeared at the door. It was Baba Uche, the old spiritualist who had set him on this dark path so many years ago. His presence, once a source of comfort, now filled Jide with dread. "You've come back," Jide said coldly, his voice tight with tension. "I thought I'd seen the last of you." Baba Uche stepped forward, his eyes filled with an ancient knowing. "You've gone too far, Jide. The path you've chosen has a price, one that you are now beginning to pay." Jide's anger flared. "I don't need your warnings now. I am the most powerful man in this country. I have everything I want. I don't need anyone, least of all you." Baba Uche's eyes narrowed. "No, you don't have everything, Jide. You have wealth, power, and fame, but not peace. Not happiness. And not your soul." Jide stiffened. "I gave up my soul a long time ago. What do you want from me?" The old man's face grew grave. "I'm not here to take anything from you, Jide. I'm here to give you one last warning: power does not last forever. You've made enemies, not just here, but in the spiritual realm. The forces you've dabbled with will turn on you. The very darkness you embraced is now hunting you, Jide laughed bitterly. And what, you think I'm afraid of some vague darkness? I've already made it to the top, Baba. I've already defeated everyone who stood in my way. Baba Uche stepped closer, his voice soft but powerful. You may have defeated men, Jide, but you cannot defeat the consequences of your actions. You have been cursed. And the time for retribution is near, Jide sneered, dismissing the old man's words. But deep down, a flicker of fear began to ignite. There was something in Baba Uche's eyes, a truth Jide could not escape. It wasn't long before the signs became impossible to ignore. The nightmares began to plague Jide every night, vivid dreams of fire and death. He would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, unsure if the dreams were premonitions or the result of his guilt gnawing at him. His health began to deteriorate. He was unable to sleep without visions of shadowy figures lurking at the edges of his vision. People who once feared and adored him began to avoid him, their eyes now filled with suspicion. Jide's greatest fear was that he had gone too far. The sacrifices, the manipulation. The darkness he had welcomed, it was all beginning to come back to him in waves of terror. He had played with fire, and now the flames were consuming him from the inside. He turned to the very forces he had summoned for help, but they were no longer on his side. The dark spirits that had once answered his every command now mocked him from the shadows, their laughter echoing in his ears. His power, once limitless, now felt like chains, dragging him deeper into despair. Jide's empire, which had once been a shining beacon of success, began to crumble. It started with a few whispers, then rumors, and soon the truth was impossible to hide. The church that he had built on lies and manipulation was exposed for what it truly was, a cult built on greed, fear, and deceit. News outlets picked up on the story, and soon, public opinion turned against him. The very people who had worshipped him began to turn their backs, demanding justice for the lives he had destroyed. Jide's name became synonymous with corruption, and his church, once a place of power, became a symbol of betrayal. But Jide's troubles didn't end there. The forces that he had once controlled were now free, and they were hunting him down. The darkness that had once served him now sought to consume him whole. His health rapidly deteriorated, his mind frayed at the edges, his body withered under the weight of the curse he had invited. On a stormy night, Jide stood at the altar of his church, staring at the empty pews. The grand building was now a shell of its former self, abandoned and neglected. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the echoes of the past rang in his ears. The voices of those he had betrayed, the whispers of those he had used, were now haunting him, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for power. In his hands, he held the ceremonial dagger, the same one he had used to seal his pact with the dark forces. As the storm raged outside, Jide closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, though he knew it would be unheard. Lord, I've come too far. I've done too much. There is no redemption for me. But if there's any chance that I can save myself, I will offer everything. He raised the dagger, and for the first time in years, the weight of his actions hit him like a wave. His entire life had been built on lies, manipulation, and greed. He had betrayed everything that was sacred. With a final, desperate cry, Jide drove the dagger into his chest, the pain searing through him. As he fell to his knees, his vision blurred, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of peace, an end to the torment that had haunted him for so long. But as he fell, he realized something. It was too late. There was no coming back from this. The story of Jide, the fraudster who sought fame, fortune, and power, spread far and wide. His name became a warning to those who sought to manipulate others for personal gain. His rise to power was fast and furious, but his fall was just as swift. A tragic tale of ambition gone too far. In the years that followed, the remnants of his empire were dismantled. His followers, once loyal, moved on, leaving behind the ruins of a man who had traded his soul for a fleeting dream. But the darkness that Jide had unleashed did not vanish. It lingered, a silent reminder of the price of unchecked ambition, and somewhere, in the deep recesses of the world, the shadows still whispered his name.